Imagine one small jeep parked on a sun-baked ridge, one man leaning over a map, and a wall of steel, 75 tanks, rolling straight toward him. They thunder like a mountain moving, metal on earth, engines hurling dust into the sky. Between that ridge and annihilation stands an idea, a single mathematician's calculation, converted into a tactic and a single vehicle used as the brain that made it work. This is a dramatized retelling inspired by real events and the wartime principle of concentrated fire. Ernst Weber was not born a soldier. He grew up in a modest quarter of Hamburg, the son of a schoolteacher and a seamstress, more at ease with chalk dust than with the clatter of boots. He loved patterns, the way waves hit a pier, the rhythm of trains on rails, how numbers folded into one another to reveal a hidden shape. As a young man, he became a secondary school teacher of mathematics, patient with examples, fond of diagrams scratched on slate. He taught students to trim problems down to core elements, isolate variables, ignore noise, find the lever. When the war took men like him from classrooms to the field, Weber kept that habit of mind. Conscription and a short period of artillery training put him with a small heavy anti-tank group attached to a divisional line near Prokhorovka in early July 1943. The battle arriving at Kursk was not an ordinary fight. It was a contest of mass. Dozens, then hundreds of tanks would be pushed forward almost as a single organism. Doctrine on paper, seasoned officers said, was to distribute anti-tank guns along the defensive frontage, cover every likely lane, spread risk, deny an enemy a single death blow. Spread the guns, they said, and a wedge of armor hits many targets and blunts slowly. Spread the guns, doctrine promised, and you avoid catastrophic local failure. Weber sat under the canvas one night and reworked that assumption as an equation. He began with simple terms. How many rounds can a gun fire in a minute? What is a reasonable chance that any one round will hit an approaching turret at effective range? And how fast do tanks close distance under fire? He wrote the numbers plainly. A typical 75mm or 76mm caliber gun could deliver, depending on crew efficiency, roughly 4 to 6 aimed rounds per minute at the ranges expected. Hit probability per aimed round, under combat stress and smoke, might be only a fraction, perhaps 10 to 20% against a moving target's vulnerable components. Those numbers, taken singly, were discouraging. Taken together, arranged cleverly, they produced a different picture. Weber's central insight was a simple, brutal arithmetic. When facing a dense formation, the defensive effect of distributed fire is diluted across many targets. The effect of concentrated fire on a small subset is multiplicative. If 8 guns focus on the first 3 tanks in the spearhead, rather than each gun firing at its own assigned target further back, the chance that those first tanks are rapidly disabled leaps dramatically. Disable the lead vehicles, and you change the geometry of the assault. The formation's momentum staggers, tanks pile up, and drivers hesitate. The frontmost tanks act as the keel of the wedge. If that keel is severed, the whole formation can be slowed or broken. He drew another line on the slate. Assume one gun has a 15% chance to immobilize a lead tank within a minute. One gun against one tank yields that 15%. But 8 guns, each with independent chances, all aiming at that same first tank, do not just add 15% 8 times. The probability that none of the 8 guns scores a disabling hit drops to a small number. In plain terms, concentrate, and you increase your odds not linearly, but exponentially. The numbers were not magic. They were leverage. There was a problem. Command doctrine frowned on clumping guns. A divisional commander, conservative and battle-hardened, argued that concentrating several anti-tank guns in one narrow arc risked exposing a cluster to artillery or to being bypassed. Spread them, he said, and deny the enemy a single decisive corridor. Weber argued with chalk and paper. He argued with diagrams. On the map, he circled a ridge and a plain, circled likely lanes of approach, and wrote down timing windows. How long before the first tanks reached effective range? How many volleys they could deliver in that window, and what reorientation time the batteries needed to switch targets. The improvised answer came in the form of a jeep. Not a weapon in itself, but a nervous system. In Weber's dramatized retelling, the Jeep was a tiny, fast platform with one radio, one map, and one man who could see forward. It could move to vantage points where the angle of approach would make the enemy formation reveal its structure. From that point, the Jeep would do three things: observe the precise moment the spearhead entered vulnerability, direct concentrated volleys from otherwise dispersed crews to a single kill sector, and, crucially, relay rapid corrections so that those volleys arrived in tight, timed bursts. Think less of the Jeep as a gun and more as a clock and a lens. It synchronized and focused disparate shooters into a single pointed force. Reports and veteran memories differ on some specifics: whether Weber drove the Jeep himself, whether he fired his own radio call sign, or whether he stayed back and scribbled orders that others passed along. What veterans did remember, and what the dramatized account centers on, is this: frontline crews began to use small mobile observers to concentrate their fire with previously unseen speed. Higher command disliked the improvisation. Contemporaries labeled it risky. Some later said even banned in their conversations, because it flouted doctrine and exposed guns to concentrated counter-battery. Whether a formal order forbidding the practice exists in the files is unclear. For the purposes of this retelling, the story will call it the banned tactic as a reflection of its controversial reputation among officers and the whispers it generated after the battle. The day the tanks arrived, the plane hummed under a dry sun. Dust rose in long ribbons as first scouts of the Soviet Armored Corps, T-34s and heavier models, pushed forward in a wedge. The assault was not perfectly tight. There were gaps and overlaps, the natural breathing of men and machines. Weber and his 8-gun crews, 56 men in total, if you include loaders, drivers, and spotters, had limited ammunition, limited time, and a single wedge of clay to turn into an anchor. The Jeep took position on a low ridge that offered a sweeping view of the approach lanes. Its driver reported in with terse commands and timings. The gun crews, who had spent days practicing reorientations, were ready. At 0 hour, the first salvos were not meant to win the fight by volume. They were surgical. Weber's calculations had shown that the most efficient use of the guns was not to pepper the entire front, but to hit the first 3 vehicles in the spearhead repeatedly. The physics is straightforward. A tracked vehicle disabled at the front can block following vehicles, create a funnel, and force other crews to take evasive action, or to thread through dangerous terrain where anti-tank guns could pick them off. A single tank taken sideways could multiply the defense's lethality because it created a choke point. Timing was everything. The gun crews had practiced a salvo rhythm: aim, fire, observe, correct, fire again. Roughly a cycle of 10 to 20 seconds per successive aimed shot when well drilled. The Jeep's observer called the moment the lead tank came into range, and then called corrections. Left 2 degrees higher by 1 notch. The first concentrated salvo struck the spearhead. Smoke blossomed, a turret went quiet, and a commander inside a T-34 found his cupola stuck at an unlucky angle. 1 vehicle stalled. Another received a track-breaking hit. The wedge's forward momentum hiccuped. Enemy crews trained for speed and for persistence. They trained to keep moving, to punch through defensive pockets. Many T-34 drivers were young and determined, but the battlefield is a place where hesitation is contagious. A stalled lead vehicle forces following crews to brake, to swerve, to change formation. In a matter of a minute, what had been a streamlined wedge became a knotted line snaking across the plain. That paralysis was the real target. The guns could not destroy every tank. They needed to disable the formation's orderly advance. Each focused volley increased the chance that another lead vehicle would fail. Again and again, the Jeep would correct, the guns would swing, and bursts of coordinated fire would hit the wedge's throat. Within 3 to 5 minutes, according to unit accounts and veteran recollection, dozens of leading vehicles were out of action, piled in wreckage and smoke. The visual is eerie: a road of stalled behemoths, their turrets dark, engines choking. Some crews abandoned their vehicles and fled across the fields. Others stayed and fought in half-paralyzed metal. The confusion bred friendly collisions and tactical gridlock. Numbers here matter less as exact science than as scale. The dramatized claim is that this method, focus the fire on the keystone of the wedge, use a mobile observer to tighten timing, and repeat, stopped an assault involving around 75 tanks. Veterans later told that number as a shorthand for the scale of the attempted breakthrough. Contemporary unit reports, which were fragmentary and competing in their counts, recorded dozens of tanks disabled in that sector. Whether the total equals 75 precisely is uncertain. What is clearer is the pattern. Concentrated fire, enabled by rapid observation and communication, created outsized effects. Several additional elements amplified the result. Terrain played a role. Fields broken by potholes and ravines made it harder for tanks to maneuver once they lost cohesion. Smoke and dust reduced visibility, turning the battlefield into a hall of mirrors where a driver could not see the true extent of chaos ahead. And human psychology compounded mechanical failure. A crew seeing the vehicles before them burning or abandoned could lose the will to push, fearing ambush or mines. Not all went as planned. The clustered guns that had delivered those focused salvos now found themselves at risk. Some received counter-battery fire. Others were flanked by assault guns that had penetrated through secondary lanes. Casualties mounted. In one dramatic exchange, a loader's leg was shattered by splintering shrapnel. Another crewman later remembered carrying a friend on his back across scorched earth to a makeshift aid station. Weber himself, if the dramatized tale is taken at face value, never sought glory. He scribbled timings into a field notebook, his face smeared with soot, then helped reload shells when men were short. What made the technique controversial back at division headquarters was not its effectiveness but its exposure. Concentration of guns meant a larger target for enemy artillery and aircraft. Doctrine feared that losing a cluster could be worse than having many scattered, each doing minimal damage. Some officers feared an over-reliance on improvisation that could become a trap in different terrain. After the battle, whispers circulated. Someone called the practice banned in frustration, or as a shorthand for do not employ without orders. Whether formal censure followed is unclear. What is clear is the tension between pragmatic frontline innovation and the conservatism of senior command. The human cost on both sides was heavy. Tank crews lost comrades, gunners lost friends, village fields were cratered, and the riverbanks later bore the pale marks of abandoned equipment. Survivors, years after the war, would return to the ridges and point to the stones where they had sheltered, to the single oak tree, where a man had seen everything and shouted corrections through a cracked radio. One veteran, Klaus Richter, later recounted in an interview, "We watched them roll in, and then suddenly the lead stopped. For a moment it was like a pause in time. You don't realize you're lucky until the dust settles." His voice, in the recorded clip, is small and deliberate. He is not boasting. He remembers the smell of burnt oil and of fear. In the years after the fighting, accounts diverged. Some historians, combing official logs, emphasize that many of the disabled tanks were the result of combined arms, minefields, infantry anti-tank teams, and airstrikes working alongside the guns. Others point to the tactical idea itself, concentrate fire on a formation's tip, as a known principle, not novel to one man, but potent in its application when linked to mobile observation. Museums that preserve the guns and tanks from that summer display, faded diagrams of wedges and concentric arcs of fire, and they present the battle as a complex interplay of technology, terrain, and improvisation. Weber, in the personal arc of this dramatized telling, chose obscurity afterward. He returned to teaching if he could, to chalk and students and the slow logic of proofs. He was offered recognition by those who knew the truth. His fellows in the battery who understood the algebra of the fight, the men who loaded and aimed under his direction. He demurred. War had given him numbers with blood attached. He did not want a medal that would forever be read next to names of the dead. He wrote later, in lines tucked into a letter home, that sometimes the cleanest equation is the one you cannot solve without losing sleep. Legacy is a strange thing. In the immediate aftermath, the banned label lingered as gossip among units. A dangerous innovation, useful but untrustworthy. Over time, instructors in armored and artillery schools began to teach concentration and the use of forward observers as part of combined arms doctrine, though couched within fuller tactical frameworks that emphasized risk mitigation. Veterans told the Jeep story around campfires. Younger soldiers listened with the kind of reverence reserved for people their age who had done something impossible. Scholars later looked at reports from July 12, 1943, at Prokhorovka and at adjacent sectors, and tried to parse fact from recollection. What remains consistent across all sources is the mathematical kernel. Focused fire on a formation's leading edge changes outcomes in ways that scattered attempts do not. There is a melancholy to this kind of victory. Tactical ingenuity saved lives in the short term, but the broader war continued its grinding logic. The preservation of a ridge on one summer morning did not make a moral ledger tip toward righteousness for those who employed it. Tanks and guns are instruments that obey no conscience. They are tools wielded by people. The story's admiration is reserved for the mind, for the cold reasoning that valued probabilities and timing over bravado, not for the cause it served. If the dramatized version leaves a single impression, let it be this: intelligence in war can magnify or mitigate force in stark ways. A single mind that understands rates, timing, and concentration can take machinery of overwhelming size and create a symmetry. That asymmetry, whether described as a banned trick or an improvised miracle, is neither a moral badge nor a neat answer. It is a fact about how complexity yields to careful analysis under pressure. This recounting has intentionally framed some elements as legendary or dramatized. The exact number 75, the precise role and wording of the ban, the Jeep's exact movements, because records differ and memory softens details into myth. What the archival fragments, veteran testimony, and the mathematics all agree upon is the underlying principle, that by focusing fire on the keystone of an armored wedge, by timing volleys into tight bursts, and by using a mobile observer to enforce those timings, a small, disciplined force could bring disproportionate effect to bear. When you stand at a museum and look at an anti-tank gun, its barrel long and silent, remember that the weapon's power was never just metal and explosive. It was the calculus that told men when and where to shoot, the courage to execute a plan, and the willingness to accept loss in order to save a broader number. Remember, too, the faces, not statistics on a page, but names, hands, children at home, because history is always a ledger of costs. If this kind of story intrigues you, subscribe for more narratives that unearth the human ideas behind history's battles. In the end, the ridge at Prokhorovka and the Jeep on its lip become a small parable. Intelligence applied at the right place, and time can slow a tide. Legends expand and round the corners of truth. They give a shape to what could otherwise be only confusion. We call the tactic banned in this story because that label reflects the controversy it provoked, the fear it inspired in cautious commanders, and the whispered respect of those who used it. Whether the number is 75 tanks or some smaller but still significant figure, the lesson remains. Concentration beats dispersion where decisive points exist. Timing multiplies effect. A single mind, using a single vehicle as a nervous system, can change the outcome of a moment. Years later, a small plaque in a local museum mentions a battery that held a ridge in July 1943. It lists dates, and it lists losses. It does not insist on legends. It does not claim certainty about banned orders or precise tallies. What it does preserve is a picture, a sketch of guns aligned, a small vehicle marked with asterisked notes, and a photograph of men looking out across a broken plain. People still come and look at that image and imagine the dust and the fear and the cold arithmetic that decided a day. They imagine Ernst Weber, whether in a Jeep or standing just beyond it, pencil in hand. They imagine a quiet man who taught others how to count, and in doing so, changed how a battle moved for a few hours. History's final account is seldom a single voice. It is a chorus. Reports boxed in files, voices hoarse with memory, the slow sifting of evidence. In this soundtrack, The dramatized tale gives shape to a core truth: that numbers can become instruments as persuasive as any weapon when wielded by someone who knows both their power and their cost. If this story moved you, share it with someone who loves untold wartime innovations, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.